What if the bread meant to sustain life carried instead the quiet breath of death? In the fields of Kentucky, where golden wheat swayed beneath an unforgiving sun, the harvest of 1856 would be remembered not for its abundance, but for the silence that followed. 11 masters would fall in a single night, their final meal blessed by hands they had never bothered to see as human. And in the whispered folklore that followed, one name would echo through the corridors of plantation houses like a prayer and a curse: Hannah. The morning mist clung to the tobacco fields like the ghosts of those who had worked them, and in that gray dawn, few could imagine that death was already kneading itself into the day's bread. The kitchen fires had been lit before sunrise, as they always were, by hands that belonged to no one and everyone. Hannah moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced silence of survival, her bare feet knowing every creaking board, every loose stone that might betray her presence to sleeping masters. But this morning carried something different. This morning, the flour held secrets. For 32 years, Hannah had known only the taste of submission. Born into chains on the Whitmore plantation in the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass country, she had learned to read the moods of white faces like weather patterns, necessary for survival, crucial for avoiding the lash. The kitchen had become her domain by necessity, not choice. Master Whitmore's wife had decreed it, so when Hannah turned 14, declaring her suited for domestic work, with the casual indifference reserved for livestock. The kitchen was a world unto itself, separated from the main house by a covered walkway that might as well have been an ocean. Here, in the perpetual heat of wood-fired ovens and the endless cycle of meals for those who would never thank her, Hannah had learned to disappear into her work. Her hands knew the rhythm of bread-making like a heartbeat, the measuring of flour, the careful addition of salt, the patient kneading that transformed separate elements into sustenance. But sustenance for whom? Never for her. Never for the children who slept 3 to a straw mattress in the quarters. Never for old Samuel, whose back had been broken by decades of tobacco harvests, or for Mary, whose own children had been sold south when the debts mounted. The bread Hannah made fed only those who owned her flesh, her time, her very breath. In CY, the evening hours, when the masters' bellies were full and their voices grew loud with whiskey and self-satisfaction, Hannah would steal moments to herself. She would stand at the kitchen window, looking out toward the quarters where lamplight flickered like dying stars, and she would remember her mother's voice. "Patience, child," her mother had whispered on her deathbed, her hands clutching Hannah's, with desperate strength. Patience and watchfulness. The Lord sees all, and vengeance belongs to Him. But 32 years of patience had yielded only more suffering. 32 years of watchfulness had shown her only cruelty compounded by indifference. And as the autumn of 1856 approached, with its promise of harvest celebration, Hannah began to wonder if perhaps the Lord needed human hands to do His work. The question haunted her dreams and followed her through her waking hours. How long must the innocent suffer while the guilty feast? September arrived with the weight of humid heat and the promise of celebration. The tobacco harvest was complete, the corn cribs full, and Master Whitmore had announced the annual harvest feast with the magnanimous air of a man who believed his prosperity was born of his own virtue. The great dining room would host neighboring planters and their families, a display of wealth and hospitality that required weeks of preparation. For the enslaved people of Whitmore Plantation, the harvest feast meant doubled labor and tripled vigilance. Every surface must gleam, every dish must be perfect, every service must be invisible. Hannah found herself at the center of the storm, responsible for the bread that would grace the tables of Kentucky's finest families. It was an honor, Mrs. Whitmore declared, that Hannah should not take lightly. The morning of the feast dawned crisp and golden, the kind of day that makes poets of ordinary men and turns even the humblest cornfield into a cathedral of light. Hannah, rose before the sun as she always did, but this morning her movements carried a different quality. Where once there had been resigned efficiency, now there was something approaching reverence. She handled the flour with the delicacy of a priest preparing communion, measured the salt with the precision of an apothecary, and when she began to knead the dough, her motions took on the rhythm of a ritual. The bread dough yielded beneath, her palms warm and pliant, a substance that would rise and transform in the heat of the oven. As she worked, Hannah found herself thinking of transformation, of how the simplest elements could become something entirely different when subjected to the right conditions. Heat could turn grain into sustenance, but what else might it accomplish? What other transformations were possible in the sacred space between raw intention and final result? The kitchen filled with the familiar sense of yeast and rising dough, but underneath it all, Hannah detected something else. Something that made her pulse quicken and her breath come shallow. The feast was hours away, but already she could taste the metallic tang of anticipation on her tongue. By afternoon, the great house buzzed with activity. Carriages arrived bearing guests in their finest clothes, their laughter echoing across the grounds like the sound of church bells celebrating their own prosperity. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as the masters greeted each other with elaborate courtesy, their wives rustling across the veranda in silk and satin that cost more than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. None of them looked toward the kitchen. None of them wondered about the hands that prepared their feast. They were gods in their own mythology, and gods do not concern themselves with the feelings of those who serve them. But tonight, Hannah thought as she shaped the final loaves, tonight they would learn that even gods must eat bread made by mortal hands. The powder had come to her like a gift from Providence itself, discovered in the darkest corner of the old smokehouse where Master Whitmore stored his veterinary supplies. Arsenic, the label read in faded letters, used for treating horses afflicted with parasites. Hannah had seen it there for months, a small tin container pushed behind bottles of liniment and jars of healing salve, forgotten by everyone except the woman who noticed everything. She had taken only what she needed, measuring it with the same careful attention she gave to salt or sugar. The powder was pale as bone dust, fine as flour, and nearly tasteless when mixed with other ingredients. It dissolved completely in water, left no trace in dough, and betrayed itself only to those who knew to look for the subtle metallic sheen it imparted to bread when the light caught it just right. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen, Hannah held the tin in her trembling hands and felt the weight of 32 years of accumulated rage. Every blow, every insult, every child sold away, every woman violated, every man worked to death, all of it crystallized into this moment. This choice, this powder that could transform bread from sustenance into judgment. Was this murder or was it justice? The question tormented her even as her hands moved with steady purpose, mixing the arsenic into the flour with the practiced motions of countless morning bread preparations. She thought of old Samuel, who would never see freedom. She thought of Mary, who wept for her lost children every night. She thought of her own mother, who had died believing that patience and faith would somehow, someday, be rewarded. But patience had yielded only more suffering. Faith had brought only disappointment. And Hannah realized that perhaps the Lord worked through many instruments, including the hands of those who had been pushed beyond endurance. The bread dough felt no different beneath her palms. It rose with the same steady patience, formed into loaves with the same satisfying weight, and when she slid the pans into the oven, the heat embraced them with the same golden promise it always had. But Hannah knew that this bread carried more than nourishment. It carried 32 years of swallowed screams, of swallowed dignity, of swallowed humanity. As the loaves baked, filling the kitchen with their seductive aroma, Hannah stood at the window and watched the last guests arrive. 11 masters would sit at the head table tonight. 11 men who owned human beings like livestock, who bought and sold children like commodities, who believed themselves entitled to everything. They surveyed 11 men who would break bread together for the last time. The oven timer chimed like a church bell, calling the faithful to worship, and Hannah removed the loaves with hands that no longer trembled. The bread was perfect, golden brown crusts that crackled when tapped, soft interiors that would melt on the tongue, the very picture of wholesome abundance. She arranged the loaves in wicker baskets lined with her finest kitchen cloths, and as she carried them toward the great house, Hannah felt something she had never experienced before, the weight of absolute power. For the first time in her 32 years of bondage, she held the lives of her masters in her hands. The dining room glowed with candlelight and crystal, filled with the sounds of refined conversation and genteel laughter. Hannah moved through the scene like a ghost, setting the bread baskets at precise intervals along the polished mahogany table. The masters barely acknowledged her presence. She was simply part of the machinery of their comfort, no more worthy of notice than the chairs they sat upon or the plates they ate from. But Hannah saw everything. She saw Master Whitmore tear into the first loaf with his thick fingers, saw him nod approvingly at the texture and taste. She saw the other masters follow his example, breaking bread together in the ancient ritual of shared hospitality. She watched them chew and swallow, consuming their doom with the satisfied smiles of men who believed themselves blessed by God. 20 minutes, she calculated, perhaps 30. That was how long the text said it would take for the symptoms to begin. Hannah retreated to the kitchen and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Through the window, she could see the golden light spilling from the dining room windows, could hear the murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, prosperous. But normality was about to end. The first sign came as a general unease, a shifting in chairs and clearing of throats that might have been attributed to overeating or too much wine. Master Whitmore paused in his discourse about tobacco prices, one hand moving unconsciously to his throat. Across the table, Colonel Morrison set down his wineglass with a slight frown, as if the vintage had suddenly turned sour. Hannah watched from the darkness. Beyond the kitchen door, her breath shallow and quick. The symptoms would progress in stages, she knew. First, the burning sensation in mouth and throat, then the nausea, then the cramping that would double a man over like a prayer. After that would come the vomiting, the desperate gasping for air, and finally, the convulsions that marked the body's surrender to poison. The conversation in the dining room grew strained, punctuated by uncomfortable silences and forced laughter. Judge Caldwell excused himself first, his face flushed and perspiring despite the cool September evening. He made it as far as the veranda before the first wave of nausea struck him down, his dignified composure dissolved into animal retching. The others followed within minutes. Master Whitmore himself tried to maintain control even as his body betrayed him, barking orders for water, for air, for someone to fetch the doctor. But the nearest physician was 20 miles away, and 20 miles might as well have been 20,000 for men whose bodies were already surrendering to the arsenic coursing through their veins. Hannah had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality surpassed even her darkest fantasies. These men who had wielded absolute power over human lives now writhed helplessly on Persian carpets, their fine clothes soaked with sweat and worse. Their wives screamed and fluttered around them like panicked birds, utterly useless in the face of true crisis. The servants, those few who were allowed in the main house, stood frozen with terror, unsure whether to help or flee. By midnight, 11 men lay dead or dying in the rooms where they had just celebrated their prosperity. The house that had echoed with laughter now rang with the sounds of agony and despair. Carriages raced away into the darkness, carrying survivors who would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering if their bread, too, might someday carry the taste of judgment. Hannah remained in the kitchen through it, all cleaning mixing bowls and kneading boards with methodical precision. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while her mind processed the magnitude of what she had accomplished. 11 masters dead. 11 men who would never again buy or sell human beings, never again separate families, never again wield the whip or the brand. But as the first gray light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows, Hannah began to understand that her moment of power was ending. The survivors would need someone to blame, and enslaved hands that had kneaded the deadly bread would be the obvious target. The machinery of justice, such as it was in slaveholding Kentucky, would grind into motion, and Hannah knew that justice for an enslaved woman looked very different from justice for a white master. She had struck her blow, delivered her judgment, tasted the terrible sweetness of revenge. But the morning was coming, and with it would come questions she could not answer, accusations she could not deny, and a reckoning that would write her name in blood across the history of Whitmore Plantation. As she dried the last mixing bowl and hung it in its proper place, Hannah wondered if the moment of absolute power had been worth the price she was about to pay. But looking out at the quarters where her people still slept, still dreamed of freedom they would never taste, she found her answer in the silence. Some prices were worth paying, some debts could only be settled in full. Dawn came like an accusation, pale and merciless, illuminating the carnage that had been hidden by darkness. The great house stood silent, except for the weeping of women and the hushed conferences of those who had survived the night. 11 bodies lay beneath white sheets in the parlor, transformed overnight from masters into corpses, from the living symbols of power into evidence of its fragility. Hannah was discovered kneading fresh bread for the morning meal, her hands moving through the familiar motions as if nothing had changed. Perhaps, in her mind, nothing had. The sun still rose, the ovens still needed feeding, and the living still required sustenance. But when Sheriff Morrison, brother to one of the dead, burst through the kitchen door with 3 armed men behind him, Hannah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "You did this," he said, and it was not a question. His eyes were wild with grief and rage, his normally neat appearance disheveled from a night spent watching his brother die in agony. "You poisoned the bread. You murdered them all." Hannah said nothing. What was there to say? That she had grown tired of watching children sold away from their mothers? That she had wearied of seeing women violated and men worked to death? That 32 years of patience had finally reached its limit? The men who faced her now would never understand such explanations. To them, she was not a person driven to desperation, but a thing that had malfunctioned, a tool that had turned against its proper use. They bound her hands with rope that bit into her wrists and dragged her from the kitchen to the great house, where the survivors had gathered to demand answers. The accusations came in waves. How long had she planned this? Who had helped her? Were other enslaved people involved? Hannah met their fury with silence, her face composed into the mask of inscrutability that had protected her for decades. But her silence only inflamed their rage. These were men and women who had never been denied anything, who had never encountered resistance they could not crush with money or violence. The idea that an enslaved woman, their property, had wielded power over them was intolerable. It challenged. The very foundations of their world suggested that the natural order they had constructed was neither natural nor ordained by God. Word spread quickly through the county. Before noon, the road to Whitmore Plantation was crowded with carriages and riders, all coming to see the enslaved woman who had poisoned her masters. Some came seeking justice, others mere spectacle, but all came with the certainty that Hannah must pay for her crime in blood. The questioning continued throughout the day, punctuated by threats and pleading and promises of mercy that everyone knew were lies. Hannah was asked repeatedly about accomplices, about plans made in the quarters, about whether this was part of a larger conspiracy among the enslaved. But she spoke only once, when Sheriff Morrison demanded to know why she had done it. "Because," "I could," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Because for once in my life, I could." The admission sent a chill through the assembled crowd. Here was no plea for understanding, no appeal to their mercy, no attempt to justify or excuse. Here was simply the acknowledgement of power exercised, of choice made, of action taken without regard for consequences. It was the most terrifying thing they had ever heard from enslaved lips. As evening approached, talk turned to punishment. Some called for immediate hanging, others for burning, still others for more creative torments that would serve as an example to any enslaved person who might harbor similar thoughts. But beneath their bloodthirsty rhetoric lay a deeper fear. If Hannah could poison bread, what other acts of resistance were possible? If one enslaved woman could kill 11 masters, what might happen if others followed her example? The very foundations of their world had been shaken, and no amount of violence against Hannah could rebuild them. The bread had been eaten, the masters were dead, and the terrible knowledge of vulnerability had been planted in minds that had never before questioned their own invincibility. That night, as Hannah sat in chains in the smokehouse where she had found her instrument of revenge, she could hear the whispered conversations drifting from the quarters. Her name was being passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer or an incantation, and she realized that regardless of what happened to her body, something had already changed forever. The enslaved people of Kentucky now knew that their masters could bleed, could die, could be brought low by the very hands they had trained to serve them. The knowledge would spread like wildfire, carrying with it the dangerous possibility that servitude was not the natural order of things, but simply an arrangement that could be altered by will and courage, and, when necessary, by poison in the bread. The trial of Hannah was less a legal proceeding than a theatrical performance, staged to restore the illusion of order to a world that had been fundamentally shaken. The courthouse in Bardstown overflowed with spectators who had come not to witness justice, but to see an enslaved woman pay for the unforgivable crime of successful rebellion. Judge Thaddeus Worthington, himself a slaveholder who had lost friends in the poisoning, presided over the proceedings with the grim determination of a man defending his entire way of life. Hannah stood in the defendant's dock without counsel, as was customary for enslaved people accused of capital crimes. The law did not recognize her right to speak in her own defense, did not acknowledge her humanity enough to grant her the protections afforded to white defendants. She was, in the eyes of the court, a piece of property that had committed a crime against its owner, and property did not require due process. The evidence against her was overwhelming and largely circumstantial. She had prepared the bread. She had access to the arsenic. 11 men had died after eating bread from her hands. The logical conclusion seemed inescapable, even if the actual proof was thinner than the court pretended. But proof was not really the point. The court needed to restore the natural order, to demonstrate that enslaved people who raised their hands against their masters would face swift and terrible punishment. Witness after witness testified to Hannah's character, painting her as a sullen and rebellious woman who had always been difficult to manage. Mrs. Whitmore, dressed in mourning black and supported by smelling salts, described how Hannah had grown increasingly insolent in recent months, how she had seemed to harbor secret grievances and unspoken resentments. The testimony built a picture of a woman consumed by hatred, driven by the inherent criminality that slaveholders believed was characteristic of African blood. But even as the prosecution built its case, cracks appeared in the narrative. Why had Hannah remained at the plantation after the poisoning? Why had she made no attempt to flee? Why had she continued her normal duties as if nothing had happened? The answers suggested either supreme confidence or complete madness, and neither possibility was comforting to the white observers who packed the courtroom. More troubling still were the whispered rumors that began to circulate during the trial. Some said that Hannah had not acted alone, that the poisoning was part of a larger conspiracy among the enslaved population. Others claimed that she had been in contact with abolitionists from the North, that the arsenic had been provided by enemies of slavery who sought to destabilize the institution from within. Still others suggested that Hannah possessed supernatural powers, that she was a witch or conjure woman who had called upon dark forces to accomplish her revenge. None of these rumors were substantiated, but they served to deepen the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that surrounded the trial. If Hannah had acted alone, she was a singular monster who could be destroyed and forgotten. But if she was part of something larger, a conspiracy, a movement, a spiritual awakening among the enslaved, then her death would solve nothing. The defense, such as it was, consisted mainly of arguments about Hannah's mental state. Surely, her lawyer argued, no sane person would commit such an act knowing that discovery and death were inevitable. The poisoning must have been the product of a diseased mind, the action of a woman driven to madness by the inherent instability of her race. It was an argument designed to diminish Hannah's agency, to transform her from a calculating rebel into a pitiable lunatic. But Hannah herself refused to play the role of madwoman. When finally allowed to speak before sentencing, she stood with quiet dignity and addressed the court in a voice that carried no trace of insanity or regret. "I am not sorry," she said, her words falling into the hushed courtroom like stones into still water. "I am not mad. I did what I did because it needed doing, and I would do it again if I could. You can kill my body, but you cannot kill what I have shown. You bleed like any other men. You die like any other men, and your children will remember that." The courtroom erupted in outrage, but beneath the angry shouts and calls for immediate execution, a deeper silence settled over the proceedings. Hannah had spoken the unspeakable truth, that the masters were merely mortal, that their power rested on illusion and fear, and that both could be shattered by a woman with nothing left to lose. Judge Worthington sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. But even as he pronounced the sentence, his voice carried a tremor that had not been there at the beginning of the trial. The performance of justice had been completed, but the fundamental questions Hannah had raised remained unanswered and unanswerable. As she was led away in chains, Hannah looked out over the crowded courtroom and saw something that made her smile, for the first time in weeks. In the back rows, where the free blacks and poor whites sat, she saw faces that carried a new expression. Not fear, not pity, but something that looked almost like admiration. The seed had been planted, the bread had been eaten, and no amount of judicial theater could undo what had already been accomplished. But Hannah's story did not end with the judge's gavel or the sheriff's noose. On the night before her scheduled execution, as autumn rain drummed against the jailhouse windows and lightning split the Kentucky sky, something happened that would transform a local scandal into enduring legend. Whether through the intervention of sympathetic guards, the action of fellow enslaved people, or simply the kind of miracle that desperate times sometimes produce, Hannah vanished from her cell like smoke dissipating in the wind. The discovery was made at dawn by a guard who found nothing but empty shackles and an open window that should have been impossible to breach. Bloodhounds were summoned, search parties organized, and rewards posted, but no trace of Hannah was ever found. It was as if the earth itself had opened to swallow her, as if the very elements had conspired to hide her from those who sought her death. Some said she had been helped by the Underground Railroad, spirited north by abolitionists who recognized the symbolic power of her survival. Others claimed that fellow enslaved people had orchestrated her escape, that a network of resistance had coalesced around her act of defiance. Still others whispered of supernatural intervention, of conjure, magic that had transported her beyond the reach of earthly justice. The truth, like Hannah herself, disappeared into the realm of folklore and legend. But the stories that grew up around her escape became part of the larger narrative of resistance that sustained enslaved communities throughout the South. In the quarters and cotton fields, in the kitchens and tobacco barns, the name of Hannah was whispered with a mixture of awe and hope. She became the woman who had poisoned her masters and lived to tell the tale. She became proof that resistance was possible, that the seemingly powerless could strike back at their oppressors, that even in the depths of bondage there remained choices that could shake the foundations of the world. Her bread became a symbol of transformation, of the possibility that the most humble materials could be turned into instruments of liberation. In the years that followed, whenever an enslaved person looked at the bread they kneaded or the meals they prepared, they remembered Hannah. Whenever a master fell ill after eating food prepared by enslaved hands, suspicion turned immediately to the possibility of poison. The very act of eating became charged with tension and uncertainty, as the masters realized that their lives depended daily on the goodwill of people they had systematically brutalized. The fear worked both ways, of course. Enslaved people who showed any sign of defiance found themselves under increased scrutiny, subjected to harsher punishments, monitored more closely than ever before. The authorities implemented new restrictions on access to potentially dangerous substances, required enslaved cooks to taste their own preparations, and established elaborate systems of surveillance designed to prevent another Hannah from emerging. But fear is a double-edged weapon, and the measures taken to prevent future poisonings only served to highlight the vulnerability of the master class. Every precaution was an admission that their power was not absolute, that their safety depended on the cooperation of people they claimed to own. The harder they worked to control their enslaved population, the more obvious it became that control was an illusion that could be shattered by a single act of determined resistance. Hannah's name spread beyond Kentucky, carried by the informal networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. In whispered conversations and coded songs, in stories told around cooking fires, and in the secret meetings of religious gatherings, her legend grew and evolved. She became a figure of folklore, but folklore with a deadly serious purpose: to keep alive the knowledge that resistance was possible, that the powerless could find ways to strike back, that freedom might be claimed by those with the courage to pay its price. Decades later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to slavery, former enslaved people would still speak of Hannah in hushed, reverent tones. She had not lived to see emancipation, but her legacy had helped to sustain the spirit of resistance that made emancipation possible. She had shown that enslaved people were not passive victims, but human beings capable of agency, choice, and terrible justice. The fields of Kentucky still sway in the autumn wind, golden wheat bending and rising like waves on an inland sea. Somewhere, in that rustling grain, old-timers say you can still hear Hannah's name if you listen carefully enough. Not spoken aloud, but carried in the whisper of stalks against stalks, in the sound of seeds falling to earth, in the eternal promise that what is planted in darkness will someday rise toward the light. The bread she baked that night was consumed long ago, but its recipe remains written in the secret history of resistance, passed down through generations of people who understood that freedom is not given but taken, that justice is not dispensed but claimed, and that sometimes the most profound acts of rebellion happen not on battlefields but in kitchens, where patient hands transform simple ingredients into the means of liberation. In the end, Hannah achieved a kind of immortality that her masters, for all their wealth and power, could never claim. They are remembered, if at all, as names on tombstones and entries in county records. But she lives on in the folklore of resistance, in the whispered stories of courage against impossible odds, in the enduring knowledge that even the most humble among us possess the power to change the world. Some say she escaped to Canada, where she lived out her days in freedom under an assumed name. Others claim she remained in Kentucky, hidden by communities of free blacks and sympathetic whites, watching from the shadows as the world she had helped to shake finally crumbled. Still others believe she simply walked into the wilderness and disappeared, becoming one with the land that had witnessed her act of terrible justice. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound than any of these stories. Perhaps Hannah lives on not in any physical form, but in the questions she forced her world to confront. What happens when the powerless decide they have nothing left to lose? What price will the oppressed finally demand for their oppression? And what transformations are possible when simple bread becomes the bearer of absolute judgment? The harvest continues year after year in the fields of Kentucky and beyond. The wheat grows golden in the sun, is cut and threshed and ground into flour, and the flour becomes bread that sustains life. But those who know the story of Hannah understand that bread can carry more than nourishment. It can carry the weight of history, the burden of injustice, and sometimes, just sometimes, the terrible, liberating taste of revenge. In the whisper of wind through wheat fields, in the crackle of wood-fired ovens, in the patient rhythm of hands kneading dough, Hannah's legacy endures. She remains what she chose to become on that night of 11 deaths, not just a victim of slavery, but its judge, jury, and executioner. She transformed herself from property into person, from servant into sovereign, from the powerless into the instrument of absolute power. And in that transformation, she left us with a question that echoes still through the corridors of history. When the bread of oppression is finally broken, what will rise in its place? The answer, like Hannah herself, remains hidden in the shadows of time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to those brave enough to ask.